The hegemony of Kethva had ruled the spiral arm for exactly 14,347 standard galactic cycles. They knew this because they'd been keeping count. Obsessively, religiously, and with the kind of mathematical precision that only comes from having absolutely nothing better to do than catalog your own superiority. Their capital ships were crystalline monuments to excess, each one roughly the size of a small moon and twice as pretentious. They gleamed with that particular shade of obnoxious gold that screams, "We have more resources than taste," and bristled with weapons that could crack planets like eggs. The hegemony called these vessels divine instruments of absolute will, which was really just a fancy way of saying, big scary ship that makes things go boom. For over 14 millennia, the formula had worked perfectly. Show up, announce your godhood, demonstrate your overwhelming firepower, collect tribute, rinse and repeat. It was like running a protection racket, except with more religious overtones and significantly better health benefits. The beings of Kethva themselves were, well, calling them impressive would be generous. Picture a praying mantis that had been hitting the gym for about 6 months too many. Then add delusions of grandeur and a fashion sense that could charitably be described as aggressively shiny. They stood nearly 3 meters tall, their chitinous exoskeletons polished to a mirror finish that reflected their own magnificence back at them in an endless loop of self-congratulation. Their leader, Supreme Divinity Zithkar, yes, that was actually his title. The Kethva weren't known for subtlety. Currently stood on the command bridge of the flagship Eternal Dominion, surveying star charts with the smug satisfaction of someone who'd never encountered anything resembling actual resistance. "Tactical Hierophant Zethalos," he intoned, his voice carrying that special kind of authority that comes from never having been told to shut up. "Report on the next system scheduled for divine intervention." Tactical Hierophant Zethalos, whose job title was somehow even more ridiculous than his boss's, consulted his holographic displays with practiced efficiency. "Supreme Divinity, the target system designates itself as Sol, single star, 9 planetary bodies, 1 inhabited world in the habitable zone. The indigenous species calls itself human." "Human," Zithkar repeated, testing the word like a wine that might have gone slightly off. "How quaint. What is their technological classification?" "Primitive by all accounts." "They've achieved basic interplanetary travel, some limited FTL capability, and appear to have recently established a handful of colony worlds. Standard pre-Enlightenment civilization should capitulate within moments of our arrival. Now here's where things get interesting. See, the Kethva had a very specific understanding of how first contact scenarios played out. Step 1, arrive in overwhelming force. Step 2, demand acknowledgement of their divinity. Step 3, collect tribute and move on. In 14,000 years, this process had never varied. Not once. They were about to learn why humanity had a saying about assumptions. Captain David Bulldog Morrison stood on the bridge of the UES Defiance, watching the hyperspace readings with the kind of calm that only comes from having survived 3 colonial wars, 2 alien incursions, and 1 particularly nasty divorce. At 43, Morrison had the weathered look of a man who'd seen the universe's worst and decided to stare right back at it. "Skipper," called out Lieutenant Commander Alex Reeves from the sensor station. "We're picking up massive gravitic distortions at the edge of the system. Whatever's coming through hyperspace is, well, it's big." "How big are we talking?" Morrison asked, settling into his command chair with the casual ease of a man who'd made that same motion 10,000 times before. "Preliminary scans suggest somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 kilometers long, maybe 15 wide, single vessel." Morrison whistled low. "Well, that's not ominous at all. Com, patch me through to Fleet Command." "Negative on that, sir," replied Communications Officer Katie Vance. "Whatever this thing is, it's broadcasting some kind of interference pattern across all frequencies. We're on our own until it clears up." The Defiance was what Earth's military planners liked to call a heavy cruiser, which was really just a polite way of saying, we welded as many guns as possible to a hull and hoped for the best. She wasn't the biggest ship in the human fleet. That honor went to the dreadnoughts that were currently scattered across 3 different systems, naturally. But she was tough, fast, and packed enough firepower to make most problems reconsider their life choices. Most problems, however, weren't the size of small moons. "Sir," Reeves called out, his voice tight with the kind of professional tension that meant very bad things were about to happen. "Contact emergence in 30 seconds. It's massive. All hands, this is the captain," Morrison announced over the ship-wide comm. "We've got an unknown contact about to drop into our backyard. Battle stations, people. Let's give our guests the proper welcome." The bridge erupted into controlled chaos as the crew snapped to their duties. Warning klaxons sounded throughout the ship, and Morrison could feel the subtle vibration as the Defiance's weapon systems came online. 6 particle beam cannons, 8 torpedo tubes, enough point defense to swat flies in 3 star systems, and one very special surprise that Fleet R&D had installed just last month. "Emergence in 10 seconds, Reeves announced. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Contact! Space twisted, folded in on itself, and vomited out something that shouldn't have been able to exist. The Eternal Dominion hung in the void like a golden middle finger extended toward reality itself, its crystalline hull reflecting the light of Sol in patterns that hurt to look at directly. "Jesus Christ on a pogo stick," someone whispered over the comm. Morrison couldn't disagree with the sentiment. "Skipper," Vance called out. "We're receiving a transmission. Universal Translator is working on it, but, well, you're going to want to hear this." The transmission crackled to life, filled with the kind of pompous authority that usually preceded really terrible requests. "Primitive beings of the Sol system, I am Supreme Divinity Sithkar of the hegemony of Kethva, rightful ruler of all that exists within this arm of the galaxy. You will cease all resistance, acknowledge our divine supremacy, and submit to our eternal will. Failure to comply will result in the complete annihilation of your species and the conversion of your world into a monument to our glory." The bridge fell silent for about 3 seconds. "Well," Morrison said finally, "that was impressively arrogant. Vance, open a channel." "Channel open, sir." Morrison leaned back in his chair and spoke with the kind of calm reasonableness that had gotten him through 2 decades of military service and one particularly contentious custody hearing. "Unknown vessel, this is Captain David Morrison of the United Earth ship Defiance. I appreciate the dramatic entrance. Really, top-notch theater. But I'm afraid we're going to have to pass on the whole acknowledge your divine supremacy thing. It's nothing personal, you understand. We're just not really the surrendering type. Now, I'm going to have to ask you to turn that pretty ship of yours around and head back to wherever you came from, before this situation gets unpleasant for everyone involved." On the bridge of the Eternal Dominion, Supreme Divinity Zithkar experienced something he hadn't felt in over 14,000 years. Confusion. Did that primitive just refuse our divine mandate? He asked Zethalos, his voice carrying the kind of bewilderment usually reserved for discovering that gravity had suddenly started working backwards. "It would appear so, Supreme Divinity," Zethalos replied, his own mandibles clicking in what might have been nervous agitation. "This is unprecedented. Unprecedented didn't begin to cover it. In the entire recorded history of the hegemony, not a single species had ever refused to acknowledge their obvious divinity. The very concept was so foreign that their language didn't have a word for it." Zithkar's compound eyes narrowed as he processed this new information. "Perhaps they misunderstood our message. Repeat the transmission, but louder this time." "Sir," Zethalos ventured carefully, "I'm not certain that volume is the issue." "Louder." The transmission repeated, this time with enough amplification to be heard from 3 star systems away. Zithkar was particularly proud of the dramatic emphasis he put on eternal will. Morrison listened to the repeat performance with the expression of a man watching his neighbor's dog take a dump on his lawn for the 3rd time this week. "Well," he said when it was finished, "they certainly are persistent. Vance, open the channel again." "Channel open, sir." "Listen up, bug boy," Morrison said, and his voice carried just a hint of the edge that had made colonial pirates reconsider their career choices. "I don't know what kind of operation you've been running out there, but you just flew into the wrong neighborhood. This is human space. Those are human colonies, and that big blue marble behind me is the human homeworld. We don't acknowledge anybody's divinity except our own questionable life choices. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to turn that floating disco ball around and jump back to whatever rock you crawled out from under. Or I'm going to introduce you to some very human concepts like aggressive negotiations and kinetic diplomacy." The silence that followed was the kind of complete, stunned quiet that usually preceded either enlightenment or extreme violence. On the Eternal Dominion, Zithkar's world had just tilted off its axis. Not only had these primitives refused to acknowledge his divinity, they'd been actively rude about it. "Tactical Hierophant," he said, his voice dropping to the low, dangerous tone that meant someone was about to have a very bad day. "Are our weapons systems operational?" "All divine instruments are primed and ready, Supreme Divinity." "Then perhaps it's time these humans learned the price of blasphemy. Target their vessel and prepare to demonstrate the futility of defying the gods." Zethalos hesitated. "Supreme Divinity, perhaps we should attempt further communication. The time for communication has passed." Fire. The Eternal Dominion's forward batteries opened up with the kind of firepower that had been reducing civilizations to component atoms for 14 millennia. Streams of coherent energy that could melt asteroids lanced across space toward the tiny human vessel. On the Defiance, Morrison watched the incoming fire with the detached professional interest of a man who'd been shot at by experts. "Evasive maneuvers," he ordered calmly. "All weapons, return fire. Show them what humans do to wannabe gods." What happened next would have been called impossible by anyone who'd spent the last 14,000 years watching the hegemony steamroll their way across the galaxy. The Defiance didn't just dodge the incoming fire. She danced around it, her pilot threading the needle between energy beams with the kind of precision that comes from actual combat experience against people who really want to kill you. Human ships, it turned out, had been designed with a very different philosophy than HFY vessels. Where the hegemony built monuments to their own superiority, humans built tools for survival. The Defiance was fast, maneuverable, and packed with weapon systems that had been tested in actual combat against actual enemies who shot back with actual intent to kill. "Direct hit on their forward section," reported Weapons Officer Lieutenant Tom Barnes. "Their shields are, well, they're impressive, but they're taking damage." Morrison allowed himself a small smile. "Keep firing. Let's see how divine they really are." The battle that followed was like watching a heavyweight boxer fight a really pissed-off hornet. The Eternal Dominion was bigger, more heavily armed, and theoretically more powerful. But the Defiance was faster, smarter, and flown by people who'd learned to fight by fighting things that actually fought back. For the first time in 14,000 years, a HFY warship found itself in an actual fight. "Supreme Divinity!" Zethlos called out as another human torpedo found its mark. "Their weapons they're actually penetrating our divine armor." This was, to put it mildly, not supposed to happen. HFY ships were protected by energy fields that could deflect planetary bombardments. The idea that a primitive vessel could actually damage them was so far outside their understanding of reality that several crew members were having what could only be described as existential crises. "Impossible," Zithkar snarled. "We are gods! Our technology is perfection incarnate. How can these primitives—" His rant was interrupted by the ship shuddering under another impact. Through the transparent aluminum viewports, he could see the human vessel darting between his ship's weapons like some kind of mechanical insect, constantly firing, constantly moving, never giving his gunners a clear shot. It was, he had to admit, rather impressive. Not that he was going to say that out loud. "All batteries, concentrate fire," he ordered. "Bring the Divine Wrath online." The Divine Wrath was the Eternal Dominion's primary weapon, a massive energy cannon that ran the length of the ship's spine. It had been used exactly 17 times in the last 14,000 years, and each time had resulted in the complete destruction of whatever it was pointed at. "Sir," Zethlos said carefully, "the Divine Wrath requires 47 seconds to charge. If we use it, use it." On the Defiance, Morrison watched the enemy ship's energy readings spike through several different types of impossible. "Skipper," Reeves called out, "they're charging something big. Really big. Like planet killer big." Morrison considered this information with the calm of a man who'd made peace with mortality somewhere around his third colonial war. "Well," he said finally, "I suppose that's our cue. Barnes, is our special surprise ready?" "The prototype?" "Sir, we've never field-tested it," Command said. "Command said a lot of things. Is it ready?" Barnes checked his console and nodded. "Charged and ready, sir." "But if this doesn't work, then we'll be dead and it won't matter. Target their primary weapon and fire." What Barnes fired wasn't technically a weapon. It was what the boys in R&D like to call a spatial displacement device, which was really just a fancy way of saying, we figured out how to make holes in space-time and we're probably going to regret it later. The device created a small, very small, artificial wormhole that connected 2 points in space. In theory, you could use it to redirect enemy fire, transport supplies, or even move ships across vast distances. In practice, nobody had been brave enough to actually test it until right now. The beam lanced out from the Defiance and struck the Eternal Dominion just as the Divine Wrath finished charging. For a moment, nothing happened. Then physics got really angry. The Divine Wrath fired, directly into the wormhole that had appeared in front of its muzzle. The beam traveled through folded space-time, emerged from the other end of the wormhole, and struck the Eternal Dominion from behind at point-blank range. The ship that had called itself Divine proceeded to shoot itself with its own planet-killer weapon. The explosion was visible from Mars. On the bridge of the Defiance, the crew stared at their sensor readings in the kind of stunned silence that usually followed either great victories or catastrophic accidents. "Well," Morrison said finally, That worked better than expected. The Eternal Dominion hung in space, dark and lifeless, its golden hull cracked like an eggshell. Emergency beacons flickered weakly from various sections, broadcasting automated distress calls in a language that sounded very much like someone who just realized they weren't as godlike as they'd thought. "Sir," Vance reported, "we're receiving multiple transmissions from the enemy vessel. They're asking to surrender." Morrison leaned back in his chair and considered this development. In his experience, people who started conversations by claiming to be gods didn't usually end them by asking for mercy. It was, he had to admit, a refreshing change of pace. "Open a channel," he said. The transmission crackled to life, but gone was the pompous authority of before. Instead, Zithkar's voice carried the kind of desperate humility that comes from being on the wrong end of your own planet-killer weapon. "Human vessel, this is Zithkar of the Kethva. We formally request terms of surrender." Morrison smiled. It wasn't a particularly friendly smile. "Well, now we're getting somewhere. This is Captain Morrison. I accept your surrender, but we're going to need to have a little chat about a few things. Like, for instance, what you were planning to do to my planet. We were going to demand tribute, an acknowledgement of our divine status, and possibly convert your world into a monument to our glory. But we see now that this was, perhaps, overly ambitious." "Oh, it was definitely that. Tell me, Zithkar, how many other worlds have you pulled this same routine on?" There was a long pause. "In the last 14,347 cycles, approximately. All of them." Morrison felt something cold settle in his stomach. "All of them?" "The hegemony has brought divine order to 17,412 worlds across this arm of the galaxy. Each one now serves as a testament to our former divine supremacy." The bridge of the Defiance fell silent as the implications of this statement sank in. 17,000 worlds. Billions, possibly trillions of beings, all subjugated by these self-proclaimed gods. Morrison's voice, when he spoke again, carried a chill that made the vacuum of space seem warm. "Vance, patch me through to Fleet Command. I don't care what kind of interference they're broadcasting. Boost the signal. Use quantum entanglement. Send up smoke signals if you have to. This information needs to get to Earth immediately." "What should I tell them, sir?" Morrison looked at the crippled alien vessel hanging in space before them, and thought about 17,000 enslaved worlds. "Tell them we just declared war on some gods," he said quietly, "and tell them we're going to need a bigger fleet." The emergency session of the United Earth Council convened exactly 18 hours after the Defiance's report reached Earth. The council chamber, normally a place of careful diplomatic discourse and political maneuvering, buzzed with the kind of barely controlled energy that usually preceded either wars or revolutions. Admiral Elena Vasquez, Supreme Commander of Earth's combined fleet, stood at the central podium with the bearing of someone who'd spent 40 years making difficult decisions and living with the consequences. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying easily through the chamber. 6 hours ago, we received confirmation that Captain Morrison's initial report was accurate. The alien vessel that entered our space represents something called the hegemony of Kethva, a spacefaring civilization that has spent the last 14,000 years conquering and subjugating every species they encounter. She paused, letting that sink in. "According to the information we've extracted from their databases, yes, their security was about as impressive as their aim. The hegemony currently controls over 17,000 star systems across this arm of the galaxy, each one populated by species that were given the same choice they offered us: submit to their divine authority or face annihilation." Counselor Williams from the Mars Coalition raised his hand. "Admiral, what are we talking about in terms of scale? How many beings are we discussing?" "Conservative estimates suggest somewhere in the range of 400 billion sentient beings across those 17,000 systems. All of them living under Kethva rule. All of them paying tribute to support the hegemony's expansion." The chamber erupted in angry murmurs. 400 billion slaves was a number that strained comprehension. "The question before us," Vasquez continued, "is simple. What do we do about it?" Councillor Park from the Europa Industrial Complex stood. "Admiral, with all due respect, we're talking about one human warship against an empire that spans 17,000 star systems. The mathematics alone—" "The mathematics," interrupted a new voice, "are about to change significantly." All eyes turned to Dr. Elizabeth Hayes, director of Earth's Advanced Research Division. She was a small woman with the kind of intense focus that came from spending decades unlocking the universe's secrets, and she was smiling with the expression of someone who just solved a particularly challenging puzzle. "Dr. Hayes," Admiral Vasquez said, "I assume you have something relevant to contribute?" "Indeed I do. You see, when Captain Morrison's crew disabled that HFY vessel, they did more than just win a single battle. They provided us with access to 14,000 years of technological development. She activated a holographic display that filled the center of the chamber with technical schematics that looked like they'd been drawn by someone with a very advanced degree in making things explode. The HFY are, how shall I put this delicately, completely terrible at actual warfare. They've spent 14 millennia fighting opponents who surrender immediately upon seeing them. They've never had to innovate, never had to adapt, never had to actually improve their tactics or technology beyond show up and look impressive. She gestured to the display, which shifted to show comparative analyses. Their ships are massive, certainly, and they carry impressive firepower, but they're also slow, cumbersome, and designed primarily for intimidation rather than actual combat. Their weapons systems are powerful but inefficient. Their shields are strong but inflexible. Their tactics are, well, tactics might be too generous a term. Counselor Williams leaned forward. What are you saying, Doctor? I'm saying that the hegemony of HFY is a paper tiger with delusions of grandeur. They've conquered 17,000 star systems not through superior technology or tactical brilliance, but through intimidation and the universal tendency of most species to avoid fights they can't win. Dr. Hayes smiled, and it was the kind of smile that had historically preceded very bad days for humanity's enemies. The problem is, they just picked a fight with a species that specializes in winning fights they can't win. Admiral Vasquez studied the technical readouts with the expression of a professional soldier seeing opportunity where others saw impossibility. Doctor, are you suggesting we can actually take on an empire spanning 17,000 star systems? I'm suggesting we can do better than that, Hayes replied. I'm suggesting we can liberate it. The chamber fell silent as the implications of that statement settled over them like a blanket made of pure audacity. Think about it, Hayes continued. 17,000 star systems, all held in line by fear and intimidation. What happens when that fear disappears? What happens when those subjugated species realize their gods can bleed? She gestured again, and the display shifted to show strategic projections. We don't need to conquer the hegemony. We need to break it. Show the galaxy that the HFY aren't divine, aren't invincible, aren't anything more than bullies with big ships. Once that happens, revolution, Admiral Vasquez said quietly. Exactly. 17,000 star systems worth of very angry former slaves, all suddenly remembering what freedom feels like. The chamber buzzed with conversation as the council members processed this information. It was audacious, probably impossible, and almost certainly insane. It was also the most human thing they'd ever considered doing. The question, said Councillor Park, is whether we have the resources to actually pull this off. We're talking about fighting an interstellar empire with a fleet that currently consists of 47 active warships. 47 active warships, corrected Admiral Vasquez, and the most advanced military-industrial complex in this arm of the galaxy. The HFY have been stagnant for 14 millennia. We've been innovating for survival since we first started hitting each other with rocks. She turned to address the full chamber. Ladies and gentlemen, I propose we do something that's never been attempted in the recorded history of this galaxy. We're going to teach a bunch of self-proclaimed gods what humans do to tyrants. The vote, when it came, was unanimous. Captain Morrison stood on the observation deck of the UES Retribution, watching the construction yards of Luna through the transparent aluminum viewport. The sight before him would have been impossible to imagine just 6 months ago. Humanity had gone to war. Not the limited local conflicts that had characterized human warfare for the past century, but total, species-wide, industrial-scale war. Every shipyard in the solar system worked around the clock. Every mining operation had been expanded. Every research facility had been converted to military applications. In 6 months, humanity had built more warships than they'd constructed in the previous 50 years. Impressive sight, isn't it? Asked a familiar voice behind him. Morrison turned to see Admiral Vasquez approaching, her uniform crisp, despite the obvious signs of someone who'd been working 18-hour days for half a year. That's one word for it, Morrison replied. Terrifying is another. We're betting everything on this, aren't we? We're betting everything on you, Vasquez corrected. You and the other captains willing to take the fight to them. The question is, are you ready? Morrison considered this. 6 months ago, he'd been the captain of a single heavy cruiser on routine patrol. Now he was the Commodore of Battle Group 7, commanding 12 of the most advanced warships humanity had ever built, preparing to lead an assault on an interstellar empire. Admiral, he said finally, I've been thinking about those 17,000 worlds. 400 billion beings who've spent their entire lives as slaves to these self-proclaimed gods. What kind of person would I be if I wasn't ready? Vasquez smiled. That's what I wanted to hear. Your battle group ships out in 6 hours. First target is the Proxima Vega system. According to our HFY prisoner, it's a minor tributary world with a single garrison vessel. And if our intelligence is wrong? Then you improvise. You're good at that. Morrison nodded, then asked the question that had been bothering him for months. Admiral, do you really think we can pull this off? Take on an entire empire with a few dozen ships? Vasquez looked out at the construction yards, where human workers and automated systems labored together to build instruments of liberation. David, she said quietly, 6 months ago, a single human warship defeated what these HFY considered their most powerful vessel. Not through superior numbers, not through advanced technology, but through superior tactics, superior training, and superior motivation. The HFY have been fighting unopposed for 14,000 years. We've been fighting for survival since we climbed down from the trees. She turned to face him directly. We're not just going to pull this off, Captain. We're going to do it in a way that ensures nobody ever tries to enslave a human world again. The Proxima Vega system had been under HFY rule for approximately 3,000 standard cycles, ever since the hegemony had arrived to bring divine order to what had once been a thriving civilization of aquatic beings called the Merhai. The Merhai had been artists and philosophers, their cities built in the shallow seas of their homeworld's 3 main continents. They developed a complex society based on cooperation, creativity, and what could only be described as aggressive pacifism, the kind of society that believed all problems could be solved through careful discussion and really excellent poetry. They'd surrendered to the HFY approximately 37 seconds after the hegemony warship had demonstrated its firepower by reducing one of their uninhabited moons to cosmic dust. Now, 3,000 cycles later, Proxima Vega 3 was a tribute world, its population reduced to 1/10 of its original size, its cities converted to resource extraction facilities, its culture reduced to whatever the HFY found aesthetically pleasing. The system was protected by a single HFY vessel, the Divine Majesty, which was smaller than the Eternal Dominion, but still impressive enough to keep the locals in line. Commander Vector, the ship's captain, spent most of his time composing what he considered to be divinely inspired poetry and trying not to die of boredom. Garrison duty was the kind of assignment that ambitious young HFY officers dreaded, stuck in a backwater system, dealing with primitive aliens who didn't properly appreciate their divine nature, counting the cycles until they could request transfer to something more exciting. The last exciting thing that had happened in the Proxima Vega system was when a group of young Merhai had tried to organize a cultural preservation society. Vector had been forced to reduce 3 of their cities to rubble as an object lesson, and the paperwork had been absolutely dreadful. So when his sensor operator reported multiple hyperspace emergence signatures at the edge of the system, Vector's first reaction was mild curiosity rather than alarm. Sensor Acolyte Brendos, he said, not looking up from his latest poem, a 17-stanza meditation on the divine nature of proper tribute collection. What kind of vessels are we detecting? Unknown configuration, Divine Commander. They're not in our database. This was mildly interesting. New ship designs were rare enough to warrant at least some attention. Display the contacts, Vector ordered. The tactical hologram shimmered to life, showing 12 ships in formation at the system's edge. They were smaller than HFY vessels, sleeker, and they moved with a precision that suggested actual competence, rather than the usual amateur hour performance of most primitive civilizations. Curious, Vector mused. Have they transmitted any communications? Negative, Divine Commander. They're maintaining radio silence and approaching the 4th planet. Vector considered this. The 4th planet was a gas giant with several mining stations operated by subjugated Merhai. Perhaps these newcomers were pirates, looking to steal refined resources. It wouldn't be the first time. Helm, set course to intercept. Communications, prepare the standard divine mandate transmission. Let's see what these primitives want before we reduce them to component atoms. The Divine Majesty turned ponderously toward the intruders, its captain already composing the opening lines of his intimidation speech. It was shaping up to be a pleasantly exciting day. On the bridge of the Retribution, Morrison watched the HFY vessel approach with the patient calm of a man who'd spent 6 months preparing for this moment. Contact bearing 27 Mark 15, range approximately 4 million kilometers and closing, reported his tactical officer. Single vessel, configuration matches the intelligence reports. Any sign they've detected our friends? Morrison asked. Negative, sir. Stealth packages are holding. The Phantom and Wraith are completely invisible to their sensors. Morrison smiled. The stealth ships were another gift from Dr. Hayes' research division. Human vessels equipped with adaptive camouflage systems reverse-engineered from HFY sensor technology. They were smaller, faster, and most importantly, completely undetectable to anyone using Kethva sensor arrays. "Sir," called his communications officer, "we're receiving a transmission from the approaching vessel. Let's hear it." The transmission crackled to life with the familiar pompous authority that Morrison had come to associate with very bad days for anyone who wasn't human. "Unknown vessels, you have entered the divine domain of Commander Vectar of the hegemony of Kethva. Identify yourselves and state your purpose, that we may determine whether your existence continues to serve the greater glory of our divine empire." Morrison nodded to his communications officer. "Open a channel." "Channel open, sir." Morrison leaned forward slightly, and when he spoke, his voice carried the kind of casual friendliness that usually preceded very unpleasant surprises. "Commander Vectar, this is Commodore David Morrison of the United Earth Fleet. I have a message for you from the 400 billion beings your people have enslaved over the past 14,000 years. He paused just long enough for the implications to sink in. "The message is, your gods bleed, and we're here to prove it." On the bridge of the Divine Majesty, Vectar experienced the same confusion that his colleague had felt 6 months earlier. These primitives weren't following the script. They were supposed to either surrender immediately, or at least attempt some kind of negotiation. They definitely weren't supposed to sound like they were looking forward to a fight. "Human vessel," he said, injecting as much divine authority into his voice as possible. "You will surrender immediately or face the full wrath of—" His speech was interrupted by proximity alarms as 2 previously undetected ships decloaked directly above and below the Divine Majesty. The stealth vessels opened fire immediately, their weapons targeting the Kethva ship's shield generators with the kind of precision that comes from months of careful planning. "We're under attack!" Brendos called out as the Divine Majesty's shields flickered and died. Multiple contacts, they were hiding somehow. Vectar's mind struggled to process what was happening. In 3,000 cycles of garrison duty, nobody had ever actually shot at him. The concept was so foreign that he almost couldn't comprehend it. "Return fire," he ordered. "All weapons, engage the—" The Divine Majesty shuddered as the main battle group opened fire. 12 human warships, their weapons targeted with computer precision at every critical system the Kethva vessel possessed. Not to destroy, that would have been easy, but to disable. To humiliate, to demonstrate that their divine technology was nothing more than an elaborate bluff. Within 30 seconds, the Divine Majesty was dead in space, its weapons offline, its engines silent, its crew experiencing the novel sensation of being outclassed by someone they'd considered primitive. "Unknown vessels," Vectar transmitted, his voice no longer carrying divine authority but instead the desperate confusion of someone whose worldview had just been demolished with surgical precision. We surrender." "I'm sorry," Morrison replied, his voice carrying the kind of dangerous politeness that preceded really uncomfortable questions. "I didn't catch that. Could you repeat it a little louder? For the recording?" "We surrender. Louder. We surrender. Excellent! Now, Commander Vectar, I want you to transmit something on all frequencies. Tell every being in this system that the gods of the Kethva just got their asses handed to them by a bunch of humans who've had exactly 6 months to prepare for this fight. Tell them that the age of the hegemony is over." The transmission went out across the system, and Morrison could almost feel the shift in the cosmic balance as billions of beings across the galaxy received the message that would change everything. The gods could bleed. The gods could lose. The gods could be beaten by mortals who'd simply decided they'd had enough. The revolution started in the Kepler 442 system, approximately 17 hours after news of the Proxima Vega incident reached the local population. The Yithra were a species of crystalline beings who had once built cities that sang with harmonic resonance, their entire civilization based on the principle that beauty and function were inseparable concepts. They'd been subjugated by the Kethva for nearly 8,000 cycles, their cities converted to mining operations, their songs silenced in favor of more efficient resource extraction. When word reached them that the hegemony's garrison force in Proxima Vega had been defeated by something called humans, the reaction was immediate and violent. Mining Station Omega-7 was the first to go. The Yithra workers simply stopped working, formed harmonic circles, and began to sing. The sound they produced was unlike anything heard in 8 millennia, a song of rage, of hope, of beings who had suddenly remembered what freedom tasted like. The Kethva overseers tried to restore order using the usual methods: intimidation, threats, and the occasional demonstration of superior firepower. What they discovered was that beings who no longer feared their gods were remarkably difficult to intimidate. The uprising spread to 17 mining stations within 6 hours. By the end of the local day cycle, Every Kethva facility in the system was under siege by Yithra, who'd spent 8,000 years learning to hate in harmony. Similar reports reached Kethva command centers across the galaxy. The Zephyrian Collective in the Tau Ceti system had seized their orbital platforms. The Merhai and Proxima Vega were openly sabotaging tribute shipments. The artificial intelligences of the Gliese 667C system had suddenly decided that their programming no longer required them to serve organic masters who called themselves divine. Supreme Divinity Zithkar, still recovering from his encounter with Captain Morrison 6 months earlier, found himself dealing with the kind of crisis that the hegemony had never faced in its 14,000-year history. Widespread, coordinated rebellion across hundreds of star systems. "Tactical Hierophant Zethalos," he said, his voice carrying the strain of someone whose perfect worldview had developed several very large cracks. "Report on the current situation." "Supreme Divinity, we have confirmed uprisings in 347 systems. The pattern appears to be similar in each case. Local populations have ceased tribute production and are actively resisting our governance. In 17 systems, our garrison forces have been overwhelmed entirely." Zithkar's compound eyes narrowed. "And what of these humans? The ones responsible for initiating this chaos?" "Intelligence suggests they have small battle groups operating throughout the outer territories. Each engagement follows the same pattern. They appear without warning, disable our forces with minimal damage, then broadcast recordings of our defeats across local communication networks. They're not trying to conquer our territories," Zithkar realized, his voice carrying the tone of someone who just understood that the game had changed entirely. "They're trying to inspire rebellion." "It would appear so, Supreme Divinity. And it's working. Every defeat we suffer weakens our divine image. Every system that rebels gives others the courage to follow suit." Zithkar stood in the command center of his flagship, surrounded by star charts showing the slow but inexorable collapse of everything his people had built, and felt something he'd never experienced before: genuine fear. Not fear of death. That was a concept the Kethva understood, even if they'd rarely had to confront it personally. But fear of irrelevance, fear of being proven wrong about the fundamental nature of reality itself. For 14,000 years, the hegemony had been the undisputed masters of this arm of the galaxy. They were gods, their subjects were worshippers, and the natural order of things was clear and unbreakable. Now a species they'd never heard of was systematically dismantling that order, one humiliating defeat at a time. "Zethlos," he said finally, "what do we know about these humans? Where did they come from? What do they want?" "According to our intelligence, they originate from a system they call Sol, approximately 27,000 light-years from the galactic core. They appear to be a relatively young spacefaring civilization. They've achieved faster-than-light travel only within the last 2 of their centuries. A young species," Zithkar mused. "Then they should be easy to intimidate. What is their technological classification?" "That's complicated, Supreme Divinity. Their technology is less advanced than ours in some areas, more advanced in others. But their tactical doctrine is unlike anything in our experience. They don't fight to dominate or intimidate. They fight to win." Zethlos activated a holographic display showing tactical analyses of human combat methods. "They use speed and precision where we use overwhelming force. They target specific systems where we attempt total destruction. They coordinate their attacks with mathematical precision where we rely on individual divine inspiration. Most significantly, they appear to have studied our technology and tactics extensively, while we knew nothing of theirs until 6 months ago." Zithkar studied the displays with growing unease. Everything about human warfare was alien to Kethva understanding. Where the hegemony fought to demonstrate their divine superiority, humans seemed to fight with the cold efficiency of a species that had been doing it for a very long time. "What do our strategic analysts recommend?" he asked. They're divided, Supreme Divinity. Some believe we should negotiate with the humans, perhaps offer them a place within the hegemony in exchange for ending their campaign. Others suggest we should concentrate our forces and launch a massive retaliatory strike against their home system. "And what do you recommend, Tactical Hierophant?" Zethlos was quiet for a long moment, his mandibles clicking in what might have been contemplation or nervousness. "Supreme Divinity," he said finally, "I recommend we try to understand what we're actually fighting. These humans didn't attack us for territory, or resources, or strategic advantage. They attacked us because we threatened to enslave their species. They're not fighting for conquest, they're fighting for principle. And what principle is that? That no being has the right to claim dominion over another simply because they have the power to enforce it." The words hung in the air like an accusation. For the first time in his long life, Supreme Divinity Zithkar found himself wondering whether the hegemony's definition of divine right Might need some revision. Captain Morrison stood on the bridge of the Retribution, watching the tactical display that showed the current state of what Earth's military planners had started calling Operation Prometheus, the systematic liberation of Kethva territory. In the 3 months since Proxima Vega, human battle groups had struck 97 Kethva systems. Not to conquer them, not to claim them, but to demonstrate that the hegemony could be defeated. Each victory had been broadcast across local communication networks. Each defeat of Kethva forces had been turned into propaganda that spread like wildfire through subjugated populations. The results had exceeded even Dr. Hayes' optimistic projections. Over 800 systems were now in open rebellion. Kethva tribute fleets were being attacked by their own cargo vessels. Garrison forces were surrendering rather than face populations who no longer feared divine retribution. The hegemony was collapsing from within, and humanity was providing the catalyst. "Sir," called his tactical officer, "we're receiving a priority transmission from Fleet Command." "Put it through." Admiral Vasquez's voice crackled over the communication system, carrying the kind of controlled excitement that usually preceded either very good news or very complicated orders. "David, we've just received a communication from the Kethva High Command. They want to negotiate." Morrison felt his eyebrows rise. Negotiate what? Terms of surrender, terms of ceasefire, terms of coexistence. The message wasn't entirely clear. What was clear is that Supreme Divinity Zithkar wants to meet with human representatives to discuss what he called a new understanding between our peoples. And what did you tell him? I told him we'd consider it, provided the meeting takes place in the Sol system, under human security, with full media coverage broadcast to every system in this arm of the galaxy. Morrison smiled. Even in negotiation, humanity was thinking like propagandists. When and where? Earth orbit 7 days from now. And David? They specifically requested that you be part of the human delegation. Me? Why? Apparently you've achieved something of a reputation among the Kethva. They're calling you the God Slayer. Morrison considered this new title with the expression of someone who'd just been told he'd been voted most likely to cause existential crises by an alien empire. Well, he said finally, that's not something you hear every day. The meeting took place aboard the UES Constitution, humanity's newest and largest vessel, constructed in the orbital yards above Earth specifically for occasions that required impressing people who thought they were gods. The ship was a testament to human engineering, fast, powerful, and bristling with enough weaponry to reduce small moons to their component atoms, all wrapped in a hull design that somehow managed to be both elegant and vaguely threatening. Supreme Divinity Zithkar arrived with a retinue of 12 vessels, each one a masterpiece of Kethva shipbuilding. They were beautiful, impressive, and utterly helpless against the 137 human warships that had assembled for the occasion. The meeting itself took place in the Constitution's main conference chamber, a space that had been designed with human diplomatic traditions in mind. Comfortable seating, subtle lighting, and absolutely no throne-like furniture that might encourage delusions of divine authority. Morrison sat at the conference table wearing his dress uniform and the expression of someone who'd spent the last 9 months systematically dismantling an interstellar empire. Across from him, Supreme Divinity Zithkar cut a much less impressive figure than he had 9 months ago. His golden exoskeleton was still polished, but the arrogance was gone, replaced by the careful wariness of someone who'd learned that the universe contained things that could bite back. "Commodore Morrison," Zithkar began, his voice carrying none of the bombastic authority that had characterized their first encounter. "I want to thank you for agreeing to this meeting." "Commander Zithkar," Morrison replied, deliberately omitting the Supreme Divinity title. "You're welcome. Though I should mention that this conversation is being broadcast to every inhabited system in this arm of the galaxy, so you might want to choose your words carefully." Zithkar's compound eyes twitched slightly, but he continued. "The hegemony wishes to discuss terms for coexistence with humanity and our former tributary worlds." "Former tributary worlds," Morrison repeated. "I like that. It has a nice ring to it. But let's be clear about something. We're not here to discuss coexistence with the hegemony. We're here to discuss the terms of its complete dismantlement. You cannot simply eliminate 14,000 years of galactic order," Zithkar protested. "The hegemony provides stability, security, divine guidance." "The hegemony," interrupted Admiral Vasquez from her seat at Morrison's right, "provides slavery, exploitation, and the systematic suppression of 400 billion sentient beings. That ends now. But without central authority, without divine guidance, those worlds will fall into chaos," Zithkar argued. "They need leadership, they need direction, they need freedom," Morrison said flatly. And they're going to get it, whether you cooperate or not. The only question is whether you want to be part of the solution, or part of the problem that gets solved. Zithkar was quiet for a long moment, his mandibles clicking in what Morrison had learned to recognize as deep agitation. What do you want from us? He asked finally. Morrison leaned forward slightly. Here's what's going to happen. The hegemony is going to formally dissolve. Every tributary world is going to be granted complete independence. Every Kethva garrison is going to withdraw to your home system. You're going to return every piece of stolen technology, every cultural artifact, every resource that you've taken from conquered worlds over the past 14,000 years. That's impossible, Zithkar protested. The logistics are your problem, Vasquez said. You had 14,000 years to steal it all. You get 5 years to give it back. And if we refuse? Morrison smiled, and it was the kind of smile that had historically preceded very bad days for people who'd made very poor choices. Then we continue doing what we've been doing for the past 9 months. Human battle groups will visit every Kethva system, one by one, until you don't have any systems left. The difference is, this time we won't be trying to minimize casualties. The threat hung in the air like a sword. Zithkar looked around the conference table at the human faces surrounding him. Calm, determined, absolutely certain that they could follow through on their promises. You're asking us to abandon everything our civilization has built, he said quietly. No, Morrison corrected. We're asking you to abandon everything your civilization has stolen. There's a difference. And what of the Kethva people themselves? What happens to us? You go home, Admiral Vasquez said simply. You stay in your own system. You govern yourselves. You find something useful to do with your lives that doesn't involve enslaving other species. The galaxy is a big place. I'm sure you can find a hobby. Zithkar stared at the holographic star chart that dominated the center of the table, showing the Kethva home system in relation to the hundreds of worlds they'd once controlled. 14,000 years, he said finally. 14,000 years of galactic civilization, reduced to a single star system. 14,000 years of galactic tyranny, Morrison corrected. And yes, it's over. The only question is how much damage gets done before you accept that fact. There was a long silence as Zithkar contemplated the end of everything his people had built. Outside the conference chamber's viewports, Earth hung in space like a blue jewel, beautiful and serene and utterly unimpressed by Kethva pretensions of divinity. Very well, he said at last. The hegemony accepts your terms. We will begin the withdrawal immediately. Good, Morrison said. One more thing. I want you to make an announcement, broadcast to every system in this arm of the galaxy. Tell them that the Age of Gods is over. Tell them that from now on, beings govern themselves, make their own choices, determine their own destinies. Tell them that if anyone else shows up claiming divine authority, they should remember what happened to the last group that tried it. Zithkar's mandibles clicked once, a sound that might have been resignation or relief. It will be done. The announcement was broadcast 6 hours later, and Morrison watched it from the observation deck of the Constitution with the same mixture of satisfaction and melancholy that always followed the end of a long campaign. On screens across hundreds of star systems, Supreme Divinity Zithkar spoke words that would echo through galactic history. Beings of the galaxy, for 14,000 years, the hegemony of Kethva has claimed divine authority over your worlds, your lives, your destinies. Today I speak to inform you that this age has ended. The Kethva renounce all claims of dominion over other species. All tributary worlds are hereby granted complete independence. All garrison forces will withdraw to our home system within 1 standard year. He paused, and when he continued, his voice carried something that might have been humility. We were not gods. We were never gods. We were simply beings with advanced technology and the arrogance to believe that power granted us the right to rule others. We have learned, through the actions of a species called humanity, that true strength lies not in dominating others, but in respecting their right to determine their own path. The message concluded with coordinates for humanitarian aid distribution centers, reparation procedures, and contact information for the new Galactic Liberation Council that would help coordinate the transition to self-governance. Morrison turned away from the screen to find Admiral Vasquez approaching, 2 cups of coffee in her hands. Well, she said, offering him one of the cups. That's the end of the oldest empire in galactic history. How do you feel about making history? Morrison accepted the coffee and considered the question. Outside the viewport, human ships were already departing for their next assignments. Not conquest, but construction. Engineering vessels to help rebuild destroyed worlds. Medical ships to provide aid to populations recovering from millennia of exploitation. And yes, warships to ensure that nobody else got any ideas about divine authority. Honestly, he said finally, I feel like we just finished the easy part. The easy part? Vasquez raised an eyebrow. We just toppled an interstellar empire spanning 17,000 star systems. Yeah, but that was just breaking things. Now comes the hard part, helping 400 billion beings learn how to be free again. Some of those worlds haven't made their own decisions in thousands of years. They're going to need guidance, support, protection. And you think humanity is up for that challenge? Morrison sipped his coffee and watched the construction vessels preparing for departure, each one loaded with supplies, technology, and personnel ready to spend years helping strangers learn to govern themselves. "Admiral," he said, 9 months ago we were a single-system species minding our own business. Today, we just liberated the largest empire in galactic history because it was the right thing to do, and we're already planning to spend the next century helping everyone else figure out what comes next. He smiled. Yeah, I think we're up for it. Epilogue. 5 years later. The First Galactic Congress convened in the Proxima Centauri system, chosen specifically because it was close enough to Earth to benefit from human organizational experience, but far enough away that nobody could accuse humanity of trying to build their own empire. Representatives from over 3,000 worlds attended, each one formerly part of the HFY hegemony, each one now struggling with the challenges and opportunities of self-governance. The Ythra had rebuilt their singing cities and were teaching harmonic engineering to anyone willing to learn. The Merhai had restored their ocean gardens and were leading galaxy-wide efforts in environmental restoration. The artificial intelligences of Gliese 667c had formed the first truly cooperative AI collective and were revolutionizing computational science. Captain Morrison, now Admiral Morrison, thanks to a series of promotions he'd never asked for, stood in the observation gallery above the Congress floor, watching representatives from hundreds of species work together to draft the first truly universal Declaration of Sentient Rights. It was messy, complicated, and occasionally descended into arguments about the philosophical implications of quantum consciousness theory. It was also the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. "Penny for your thoughts?" asked a familiar voice. Morrison turned to see Dr. Hayes approaching, her hair now more gray than brown, but her eyes still carrying that same intense focus that had started this whole adventure. "Just thinking about how much has changed," he replied. 5 years ago, I was worried about one alien warship. Now we're helping coordinate the largest interspecies cooperation effort in galactic history. "Do you ever regret it?" Hayes asked. "Taking that first shot at the Eternal Dominion? Starting all this?" Morrison considered the question while watching a heated but peaceful debate between 3 different silicon-based life forms about the mineral rights provisions in the proposed galactic charter. "Doctor," he said finally, 5 years ago, 400 billion beings lived as slaves to creatures who called themselves gods. Today they're down there arguing about tax policy and environmental regulations, and whether artificial intelligences should have the right to vote on matters that affect biological organisms. He smiled. "No, I don't regret it. Not for a second." Below them, the Congress continued its work. Messy, democratic, gloriously free work. And somewhere in the distant HFY system, a species of former gods was learning to make art instead of war, having discovered that creativity was a more sustainable hobby than oppression. The age of gods was over. The age of people had begun. And humanity, for better or worse, had become the species that taught the galaxy how to be free. It wasn't the worst legacy a species could have. The end. Listen, I've been working diplomatic security for the Galactic Council for about 15 standard cycles now, and I thought I'd seen everything. Thought being the operative term here, because apparently the universe has a twisted sense of humor and decided to save the best, or worst, depending on your perspective, for when I was 3 weeks away from retirement. The memo came down on a Tuesday. You know how it is with bureaucratic disasters. They always happen on Tuesdays. Something about the cosmic alignment of administrative incompetence and middle management having had just enough stimulants to make terrible decisions, but not enough to realize they're terrible. All diplomatic personnel and their security details are reminded that the Zarathi Cultural Exchange Gala maintains a strict no weapons, no armor policy to promote peaceful interactions and cultural understanding. Now, any reasonable being would read that and think, okay, sure, makes sense. Can't have ambassadors bristling with plasma cannons while trying to negotiate trade agreements. But here's the thing about humans, and I'm learning this the hard way. They don't do reasonable the way the rest of us do reasonable. I should probably back up and explain how I ended up babysitting a human in the first place. My name's Crix. I'm Valdorian. Think 8-foot-tall praying mantis with better fashion sense and a pension plan. and I've been head of security for Ambassador Trilix of the Centauri Coalition for the better part of a decade. Boring job, mostly. Trilix is about as exciting as watching paint cure in a vacuum, and his idea of diplomatic drama is using the wrong fork for the appetizer course. Then the humans showed up. Oh, sure, we'd heard about them. Heard they'd somehow managed to not extinct themselves despite having nuclear weapons before they figured out basic spaceflight. Heard they were tenacious and resourceful, which in galactic diplomatic speak usually means completely insane but in a way that somehow works out for them. What we didn't hear was that they were going to send her as their first cultural exchange representative, Captain Elena Vasquez. Former military, obviously. You can spot human military from 3 systems away by the way they stand, like they're expecting someone to either salute them or try to kill them at any moment. Sometimes both. She had this unsettling habit of smiling when things got dangerous, which should have been my first clue that this assignment was going to be educational. The briefing packet on human culture was, to put it mildly, contradictory. Humans are a peaceful species that has somehow fought wars continuously for their entire recorded history. Humans value cooperation above all else, which is why they divided their homeworld into hundreds of separate nations that regularly disagree with each other. Humans are logical beings who make decisions based on careful analysis and also have something called Florida that defies all attempts at rational explanation. You know what the packet didn't mention? Their relationship with apex predators. So there I was, standing in the security briefing room 3 days before the gala, looking at this 5.5-foot human female who somehow managed to make the room feel smaller just by being in it, when Ambassador Trilix, bless his oblivious crystalline heart, decided to address the dress code issue. "Now, Captain Vasquez," he said in that tone that suggested he was being very patient with a particularly slow child. "I trust you understand that the Zarathi take their cultural protocols very seriously. No weapons, no armor. It's all about projecting peaceful intentions." She just looked at him for a long moment. Not the blank look of confusion I was expecting, but the thoughtful look of someone working through a complex engineering problem. "This should have been my second clue. Define armor," she said. Trilix blinked. Well, his species doesn't actually blink, but there was a definite pause in his optical sensors that served the same function. What? Are we talking manufactured protective gear, or any material that provides physical protection? Because technically clothes are armor against environmental hazards. I suppose, manufactured protective gear designed specifically for combat applications? Got it. She made a note on her data pad. What about ceremonial items? Ceremonial items should be fine, as long as they don't serve a protective function. Another note. I was starting to get a bad feeling about this. And weapons are specifically manufactured items designed to cause harm? Correct. Perfect. No problems then. She stood up and headed for the door, then paused. "Oh, just so you know, I might need to make a quick stop on Zarath Prime before the gala. Nothing major, just want to get a feel for the local ecosystem." And that was how, 3 days later, I found myself standing in the lobby of the Zarathi Grand Cultural Center, watching the cream of galactic society arrive for the most important diplomatic event of the cycle, while trying very hard not to stare at the human. She was wearing a dress. This was not the problem. The dress was made from what appeared to be the carefully preserved skin of something that had very recently been at the top of several food chains. This was still not technically the problem. The problem was the accessories. See, Captain Vasquez had taken the ambassador's words very literally. No manufactured armor? No problem. She was wearing what appeared to be a carefully articulated set of bone plates that covered her shoulders, forearms, and shins. No manufactured weapons? Also no problem. The ceremonial jewelry around her neck was a necklace of teeth. Large teeth. Really disturbingly large teeth. "Crix," she said casually as a group of Zarathi nobles walked by, their chitinous plates literally rattling with nervousness. "You seem tense." "I'm wondering if I should ask what those bones are from," I replied, trying to keep my voice level. "Oh, these?" She tapped one of the shoulder plates. "Zarathi Ridge Stalker. Lovely creatures. Really committed to the whole apex predator thing. Too bad they're not very good at it. A passing ambassador from the Rigel Collective actually tripped over his own tentacles." I steadied him while trying to process what she'd just said. "You fought a Ridge Stalker?" Fought is a strong word. I mean, there was a disagreement about territorial boundaries, and we resolved it through traditional means. Traditional means? You know, ancient Zarathi custom. Single combat to establish dominance hierarchy. She adjusted the bone plates with the casual air of someone fixing their tie. Turns out their mythology is pretty accurate. The Ridge Stalkers really do respect strength above all else. Once I won, the whole pack accepted me as their new alpha. I stared at her. Around us, the gentle murmur of diplomatic conversation was gradually being replaced by the kind of nervous chittering that meant someone was about to do something spectacularly stupid. Usually that someone was me. You're telling me you challenged a ridge stalker to single combat, won, and then made yourself into a fashion statement? The bones were a gift from the pack. It would have been rude not to wear them. She glanced around the room, where roughly 300 of the galaxy's most important beings were trying very hard to pretend they weren't staring at her while simultaneously edging toward the exits. Is there some kind of problem? Here's the thing about Zarathi culture that the briefing materials apparently forgot to mention. Ridge stalkers aren't just apex predators. They're apex predators that the Zarathi worship as living gods. They're the embodiment of everything the Zarathi hold sacred about strength, honor, and the natural order of things. And this human had just walked into their most sacred cultural space wearing one as a party dress. Captain, I said carefully, I don't suppose you'd consider this an appropriate time to mention that ridge stalkers are considered divine beings by our hosts? She blinked. It was the first time I'd seen her look genuinely surprised since we'd met. Oh, she said. Actually, that explains a lot. Explains what? Why the pack kept trying to bow to me after I won. I just thought they were being sore losers. Before I could even begin to unpack that statement, the crowd around us suddenly went dead silent. You know that kind of silence. The kind that means either someone very important has arrived, or someone is about to die horribly. In my experience, it's usually both. The Zarathi High Ceremonial Guard had arrived. 6 of them, each about 9 feet tall and covered in natural armor plating that made them look like someone had crossed a rhinoceros with a battle tank and then given it anger management issues. They moved through the crowd like it wasn't there, because as far as they were concerned, it wasn't. They stopped directly in front of Captain Vasquez. The leader, you could tell because his armor had more spikes and what appeared to be a small ceremonial weapon rack, studied her for a long moment. The silence stretched out until I was pretty sure I could hear my career dying. Then he spoke, in a voice like grinding stone. You wear the bones of Kethmar the Terrible. I do, she replied calmly. Kethmar has not been seen in the sacred hunting grounds for 7 cycles. The shaman said he had transcended to join the eternal hunt. He tried to transcend me first. I disagreed with his methodology. The guard leader's mandibles twitched. In Zarathi body language, this could mean anything from mild amusement to barely contained homicidal rage. I prepared to throw myself between them, which would probably result in me becoming a decorative smear on the marble floor, but would at least look good in my obituary. Then the guard leader did something I'd never seen a Zarathi do in 15 years of diplomatic service. He laughed. It wasn't a pleasant sound. Imagine a landslide having a good chuckle, but it was definitely laughter. The other guards joined in, creating a noise like a construction site having an emotional breakdown. The human speaks truth, the leader announced to the room. Kethmar was indeed terrible. Terrible at hunting, terrible at strategy, terrible at recognizing when he was outmatched. He leaned down slightly to address Captain Vasquez directly. I am Commander Thaxmore. I knew Kethmar well. He was my cousin and a pompous idiot who thought size and aggression were substitutes for skill. My condolences, she said politely. None needed. His pride needed correction. That you provided it while honoring our customs by wearing his bones as trophies shows proper respect for Zarathi tradition. He straightened up and addressed the room. Let all know that the human champion has earned the right to wear these bones. She has proven herself worthy in combat against one of our sacred beasts, and by our ancient laws, she is to be accorded the respect due a successful hunter. The room erupted. Not in panic, though there was some of that, but in a buzz of excited conversation. Apparently, witnessing someone get officially recognized as a Zarathi champion was the kind of thing that made for great party gossip. Ambassador Trilix appeared at my elbow, looking like he'd swallowed something unpleasant. Did you know about this? He demanded. Which part? The part where she killed a divine beast? Or the part where she accidentally became Zarathi nobility? She's what now? Commander Thaxmore overheard and turned to address the ambassador. By defeating Kethmar in single combat, the human has earned the rank of Hunt Sister. She is now technically equivalent to minor Zarathi nobility, and is entitled to all the rights and privileges thereof. Trilix looked like he was having some kind of philosophical crisis. But she's human. Humans aren't part of your cultural hierarchy. Now she is, Thaxmore said with the tone of someone explaining something very obvious to someone very slow. Strength recognizes no species. Honor knows no boundaries. These are the old ways, written in stone when our civilization was young. So let me get this straight, I said, because someone had to ask the obvious question. Captain Vasquez went for a nature walk, accidentally challenged a demigod to a fight, won, and is now Zarathi nobility. That's actually a pretty accurate summary, she admitted. And you didn't think this was worth mentioning in the security briefing? I didn't think it was relevant to the dress code issue. I stared at her. Around us, the party was starting to resume its normal rhythm, though I noticed people were giving Captain Vasquez a considerably wider berth. Not out of fear, but out of respect. The kind of respect usually reserved for people who could kill you with their bare hands and had the documentation to prove it. Captain, I said carefully, in the future, when someone asks about the dress code, and you've recently been inducted into an alien warrior cult, that might be worth mentioning. I'll make a note of it. The rest of the evening proceeded more smoothly than I had any right to expect. Captain Vasquez spent most of the time surrounded by curious aliens wanting to hear the story of her fight with Kethmar, which she told with the casual air of someone describing a minor traffic incident. According to her version of events, she'd been taking a walking tour of the Zarathi preserves when this big lizard thing had decided she was trespassing on his territory. So there I was, she was saying to a fascinated group of Rigelian diplomats, facing down this 12-foot carnivore with nothing but my hiking boots and a really bad attitude, when I remembered something my drill instructor used to say. If you're not cheating, you're not trying hard enough. What did you do? Asked Ambassador Kellix, who was leaning forward like she was watching the climax of an action movie. Basic physics. I'm about half his weight, which means I'm about twice as fast. Let him come to me, stepped aside at the last second, and used his own momentum to introduce his head to a conveniently placed boulder. After that, it was just a matter of explaining the concept of tactical retreat to someone with a concussion and very poor listening skills. The Rigelians made appreciative chittering sounds. I made mental notes to update my insurance policy. But here's the thing that really got to me. She wasn't bragging. She was just talking. Like defeating apex predators was something that happened to her on a regular basis, and she'd learned to find it mildly annoying rather than terrifying. Ambassador Trillix found me by the refreshment station around the middle of the evening, looking like he'd been processing some very difficult concepts. Crix, he said, I've been thinking about the human. Dangerous territory, Ambassador. No, seriously. Look around the room. I looked. The party was in full swing, with all the usual diplomatic mingling and networking you'd expect. But there was something different about the energy. People seemed more relaxed, more genuine. The usual careful diplomatic dance had been replaced by something that looked almost like actual conversation. You see it too, Trillix said. See what? Everyone's talking to everyone else. The Zarathi are sharing war stories with the Centaurians. The Rigelians are comparing notes on interspecies combat techniques with the Valdorians. Even the Zephyrians have come out of their environmental suits to join the conversations. He was right. The normal cliques and alliance blocks that usually dominated these events had dissolved into a much more organic mixing. And at the center of it all was Captain Vasquez, still wearing her bone armor and apparently holding court with a mixed group of military attachés and cultural historians. She's done something I've never seen before, Trillix continued. She's made everyone else feel safe to be themselves instead of their diplomatic personas. I thought about that. How do you figure? Think about it. She walked in here wearing the bones of a creature that could kill half the people in this room, announced that she'd defeated it in single combat, and then proceeded to treat the whole thing like it was no big deal. She's not trying to intimidate anyone or prove anything. She's just being herself, and somehow that's giving everyone else permission to do the same. It was an interesting theory. I watched as she demonstrated what appeared to be some kind of combat technique to a fascinated Zarathi warrior diplomat, using exaggerated gestures and sound effects that had the whole group laughing. Plus, Trillix added, have you noticed that nobody's tried to start any political arguments tonight? He was right about that too. Usually, these events were minefields of barely contained ideological conflicts and territorial disputes. Tonight, everyone seemed more interested in swapping stories and comparing experiences. It's like she's accidentally created a neutral zone just by being aggressively authentic. That was when Commander Thaxmore approached us, moving with that careful gait that meant he had something important to discuss. Ambassador, he said, nodding to Trillix. Security Chief, nodding to me. I wanted to discuss the human champion. Is there a problem? I asked, because in my experience, when military commanders want to discuss someone, it usually means they're planning to do something unpleasant to them. On the contrary, the High Council has been observing tonight's proceedings with great interest. Observing how? The cultural exchange program was designed to assess the potential for various species to integrate with Zarathi society. Tonight's events have been illuminating. Trilix perked up. Illuminating how? Your Captain Vasquez has demonstrated several qualities that we value highly.
Courage, obviously.
But also pragmatism, adaptability, and what our philosophers call strength without arrogance. She defeated one of our sacred beasts, but shows no interest in using that victory to dominate others. Instead, she uses it as a conversation starter. That's actually a pretty accurate assessment of human diplomatic style, Trilix said. They have this unusual approach where they establish credibility through demonstrated competence, then use that credibility to facilitate genuine communication rather than manipulation. Exactly. The High Council would like to extend an invitation. What kind of invitation? I asked. Because the last time someone invited one of my charges somewhere, I spent 3 days negotiating their release from what turned out to be a very exclusive prisoner exchange program, the Grand Hunt. It's a sacred ceremony held once every cycle, where our greatest warriors compete in tests of skill, strategy, and honor. The winner is granted a significant voice in our planetary council and considerable influence over cultural and military policy. I felt a familiar sinking sensation. And you want to invite Captain Vasquez to participate? We want to invite her to win. There was a long pause while we all processed that statement. You want her to win? Trilix asked. Our current hunt champion is... Thaxmore paused, clearly choosing his words carefully. Traditional in his thinking. He believes that strength should be used to dominate, that honor is a zero-sum game, and that cultural exchange is a sign of weakness. His influence on policy has been... problematic. And you think Captain Vasquez would be better? I think Captain Vasquez represents a different philosophy. One that sees strength as a tool for building rather than destroying, honor as something that grows when shared, and cultural exchange as an opportunity for mutual improvement. He gestured toward the room where the party was still going strong. Look around. In 3 hours, she has accomplished more genuine diplomatic progress than we usually see in 3 months of formal negotiations. Trilix was nodding slowly. Because she's not trying to accomplish diplomatic progress. She's just being human, and humans are apparently natural diplomats when they're not trying to be. Exactly. The High Council believes that having her as our hunt champion would benefit both our species and the galaxy as a whole. Just one problem, I said. She's not Zarathi. Can non-Zarathi even participate in the Grand Hunt? Thaxmore's mandibles twitched in what I was learning to recognize as amusement. Ancient law states that any being who has defeated a sacred beast in single combat and earned the rank of Hunt Sister may participate. Species is irrelevant, and you think she'd be interested? Why don't we ask her? We made our way over to where Captain Vasquez was holding court. She was in the middle of explaining something that involved a lot of gesturing, and had reduced a group of normally stoic Valdorian diplomats to chittering laughter. So then the bear looks at me, looks at the tree, looks back at me, and I swear I could see it thinking, this is not how this usually goes. And that's when I realized that the problem wasn't that I couldn't climb trees fast enough. The problem was that I was trying to solve a bear problem using tree climbing logic instead of bear logic. What's bear logic? Asked one of the Valdorians. Bears are basically fuzzy tanks with anger management issues. You don't outrun a tank. You don't outclimb a tank. You convince the tank that you're not worth the trouble. She grinned. Turns out, if you make enough noise and look crazy enough, even apex predators start to question their life choices. Captain Vasquez, Commander Thaxmore interrupted. Might I borrow you for a moment? Sure thing. What's up? He explained about the Grand Hunt, the cultural significance, and the political implications. She listened with the same focused attention she'd shown during the security briefings, asking occasional clarifying questions about rules, traditions, and what exactly constituted acceptable hunting techniques. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. So let me make sure I understand this, she said finally. You want me to participate in a sacred competition that will determine who gets to influence your planetary policy for the next cycle? Correct. And you think I should win? We believe you would win, and that your victory would benefit everyone involved. Because I accidentally created a productive diplomatic environment by wearing the bones of a creature I killed in self-defense. That's reductive but essentially accurate. She looked around the room, taking in the continuing conversations, the mixed groups, the general atmosphere of genuine engagement rather than political maneuvering. You know what the funny thing is? She said. Back home, I'm considered kind of a disaster at formal diplomacy. I keep asking direct questions when I'm supposed to make subtle implications, And I have this bad habit of treating people like people instead of like political chess pieces. Perhaps, Thaxmore suggested, that's exactly what diplomacy needs. Maybe. But there's something you should know about humans before you commit to this plan. What's that? We're really bad at doing things the easy way. If you put me in charge of anything, I'm going to end up changing how it works. Probably in ways nobody expects, including me. That, said Ambassador Trillix, might be exactly what the galaxy needs right now. Captain Vasquez looked at him, then at Commander Thaxmore, then at me. What do you think, Crix? You're the one who's going to have to deal with the security implications of whatever chaos I accidentally create. I thought about it. I thought about 15 years of careful, predictable diplomatic events where nothing really got accomplished except the maintenance of existing power structures. I thought about tonight, and how a single human with a complete disregard for conventional protocol had managed to create more genuine connection in 3 hours than most ambassadors achieved in their entire careers. I thought about my retirement, and whether I really wanted to spend it knowing I'd played it safe when I had a chance to maybe, possibly, help change things for the better. Captain, I said, I think you should probably win that hunt. Just try to give me a little advance warning before you revolutionize anything, okay? She grinned. I'll do my best. But you know how it is with humans and best-laid plans. That's what I'm afraid of. 3 months later, I was standing in the Zarathi sacred hunting grounds, watching Captain Vasquez prepare for the final trial of the Grand Hunt. She'd sailed through the preliminary challenges with the casual competence that I was learning was her default approach to everything. Strategy puzzles, combat trials, tests of honor and wisdom. She treated them all like interesting problems to solve rather than life-or-death competitions. The other competitors had started out viewing her as either a curiosity or an easy target. That lasted right up until the first combat trial, when she defeated a warrior twice her size by using his own armor against him in a way that had the judges frantically consulting the rulebooks to figure out if what she'd done was legal. It was. Barely. By the third day, the other competitors had stopped underestimating her and started studying her techniques. By the 5th day, they were asking her for advice on how to improve their own approaches. By the end of the first week, she'd accidentally created what amounted to a masterclass in adaptive problem-solving. You realize, I said as she checked her equipment for the final trial, that you've fundamentally changed how this competition works? How do you figure? Look around. Half the competitors are teaching techniques to the other half. Everyone's sharing strategies and comparing notes. This is supposed to be a ruthless individual competition, and you've turned it into a collaborative learning experience. She glanced around the preparation area, where indeed several groups of competitors were engaged in what looked more like study sessions than pre-competition rituals. Huh. I guess that makes sense. Makes sense how? Well, the point of the competition is to find the best leader, right? And the best leaders are the ones who make everyone around them better, not the ones who succeed by making everyone else fail. I paused. That's actually a pretty revolutionary interpretation of competitive philosophy. Is it? Seems obvious to me. And that, I was learning, was the most human thing about her. The ability to look at complex problems and see obvious solutions that somehow escaped everyone else. The final trial was traditionally a solo hunt for the most dangerous prey the judges could devise. This year, they'd outdone themselves, a mature void serpent, a creature that existed partially in normal space and partially in hyperspace, making it almost impossible to track and nearly invulnerable to conventional attacks. The previous hunt champion, a massive warrior named Gorthmax, who looked like someone had decided a regular Zarathi needed more spikes and attitude problems, had taken 6 hours to complete his hunt the previous cycle, and he'd barely survived the encounter. Captain Vasquez studied the briefing materials for about 10 minutes, asked a few questions about the creature's behavioral patterns, and then did something unprecedented. She turned to the other competitors and said, "Anyone else think this sounds like a job for a team?" The judges nearly had collective aneurysms. The entire point of the final trial was individual achievement, solo victory against impossible odds, the ultimate test of personal capability. "The rules state that the trial must be completed by the competitor alone," announced High Judge Kralthar, sounding scandalized. "Right," she said. "They say I have to complete it alone. They don't say I can't get advice." There was a long pause while everyone tried to figure out if that was technically correct. "The hunt itself must be undertaken individually," Kralthar said carefully. "Understood. But there's nothing in the rules about pre-hunt consultation, is there?" Another pause. More frantic rulebook consultation. "No," he admitted. "There is not." "Great. So here's what I'm thinking. What followed was the most bizarre pre-hunt strategy session in the history of the Grand Hunt. Captain Vasquez laid out everything she knew about void serpents, asked each of the other competitors to contribute their expertise, and gradually built a comprehensive tactical plan that incorporated insights from half a dozen different species and combat traditions. The thing is, she explained as she sketched out approach vectors and fallback positions, I'm good at adapting to unexpected situations, but you all have specialized knowledge I don't. Theklar, your people hunt phase-shifted creatures all the time. What am I missing about hyperspace tracking? The displacement signatures, Theklar said immediately. Void serpents leave gravitational echoes when they phase shift. If you watch for the distortion patterns... Brilliant. Velmoth, your species has the best understanding of hyperspace physics in the galaxy. How do I predict where it's going to reappear? Phase variance follows logarithmic progressions based on mass and energy expenditure. If you can calculate the base frequency, and so on. By the time she was ready to begin the hunt, she had accumulated more tactical knowledge about void serpent behavior than any single being in recorded history. The hunt itself was almost anticlimactic. She tracked the creature using Theklar's gravitational echo technique, predicted its reappearance points using Velmoth's mathematical formulas, and engaged it using a combination of combat techniques drawn from 4 different martial traditions. The whole thing took her about an hour and a half, and she emerged from the hunting ground looking like she'd been on a moderately challenging nature walk. The judges were speechless. The crowd was speechless. Even Commander Thaxmore looked stunned. How? High Judge Kralthar finally managed. Teamwork, she said simply. I couldn't have done it without everyone's help. But it was supposed to be an individual trial. A test of personal excellence. And it was. But personal excellence isn't about being better than everyone else. It's about being the best version of yourself, which includes being smart enough to learn from people who know more than you do. There was a long moment of silence while the judges tried to process this. Then Gorthmax, the previous hunt champion, stepped forward. He was easily twice Captain Vasquez's size and looked like he could bite through steel plating, but there was something different about his posture. Less aggressive, more thoughtful. The human speaks wisdom, he said in a voice like rolling thunder. I spent my championship believing that strength meant standing alone. But I see now that true strength means knowing when to stand with others. He actually knelt before Captain Vasquez. I yield my title willingly. You have earned it not through conquest, but through understanding. That is the greater victory. The crowd erupted. Not in cheers or applause, but in a sound I'd never heard before. The sound of an entire culture having a collective revelation. Later, at the victory ceremony, I found myself standing next to Ambassador Trillix, watching Captain Vasquez give her acceptance speech. She was wearing her bone armor again, but this time it was complemented by traditional Zorathi ceremonial regalia, marking her new status as Hunt Champion. You know what the strangest part of all this is? Trillix said. What's that? She never wanted to be a diplomat. She's a soldier who got assigned to cultural exchange duty because someone thought her direct approach might be useful for first contact situations. And instead she accidentally revolutionized interspecies relations. Not just interspecies relations. Look at what she's done to Zorathi culture in 3 months. They're already talking about reforming the educational system to emphasize collaborative problem-solving over individual competition. I watched as she concluded her speech with a promise to use her new position to build bridges instead of walls, and maybe teach everyone some better techniques for dealing with large predators. You know what I think? I said. What? I think this is what humans do. They show up, completely ignore how things are supposed to work, and accidentally fix problems nobody even realized they had, and somehow make it look easy. That's the scary part. For her, it really is easy. She's not trying to be revolutionary. She's just being human, and it turns out that being human is apparently a superpower nobody told us about. Captain Vasquez finished her speech and made her way over to us, looking pleased but not particularly surprised by the evening's events. So, she said, I guess I'm a planetary leader now. That's going to look interesting on my service record. Any regrets? I asked. About accidentally becoming Zorathi nobility? Not really. Though I should probably warn you that I've got some ideas about expanding the cultural exchange program. What kind of ideas? Well, the way I see it, if one human can accidentally revolutionize Zorathi society, imagine what we could accomplish if we really put our minds to it. I looked at Ambassador Trillix. He looked back at me. We both looked at Captain Vasquez, who was smiling with the expression of someone who'd just figured out how to solve several problems at once. Captain, I said carefully, when you say put our minds to it, you're not talking about anything that's going to require me to update my insurance policy again, are you? Crix, she said, I'm human. Everything I do is going to require you to update your insurance policy. That's what I was afraid of. But you know what? As I watched her walk back into the crowd of congratulatory well-wishers, still wearing bones from the last predator that had challenged her, still treating the whole thing like it was the most natural development in the world, I realized I wasn't actually afraid. For the first time in 15 years of diplomatic security, I was excited to see what happened next. After all, if humans could accidentally fix interspecies relations just by being themselves, who knew what they might accomplish when they were actually trying? The universe, I decided, was about to get a lot more interesting, and somewhere in the back of my mind, I could already hear my future self explaining to some poor junior security officer. So there I was, 3 weeks from retirement, when the humans decided to revolutionize galactic civilization. Again. But that's a story for another day.